of that PRA paper. There are 57 pages, and I'm just building up all that small print on the screen here. We did a survey earlier, and even heads of operational resilience, over a quarter of them were willing to confess that they hadn't read all of it. So let's just help you begin that process with some orientation. The paper is in two parts. The first third, roughly, is providing context, and then the second two-thirds is the draft supervisory statement. Let's see how that builds up. Essentially, I think it's rather like one of my teachers used to advise when you teach. Tell them what you're going to tell them, tell them what you told them. The PRA paper is a little bit like that on outsourcing and third-party risk management. It starts just by highlighting that as a discussion paper, responses are required by Friday the 3rd of April. So you've got just over 3 months. It is relevant, certainly, to everybody on this WebEx. The consultation paper is relevant to almost all UK firms. There are some credit unions that it's not fully relevant to. Key action that's highlighted that builds on work that many of you will be doing in insurance and banking, hedge funds. I see you who are on the call. For all of you, you need to complete your outsourcing register by the end of next year. We'll come to the details on that and how it builds on outsourcing of cloud service providers and other initiatives that some of you have already been required to do, building on those EBA, EIOPA, and Treasury Select Committee reports. In the PRA paper, there's quite some detail about what the Treasury Select Committee was requiring when they issued a paper back in October last year, following the TSB challenges. As a particular area of operational resilience, but recognising that third parties and cyber are increasingly important. And then the introductory third continues by explaining what is in the draft supervisory statement. It begins with definition and scope, goes on to talk about proportionality, governance, record keeping and materiality, due diligence agreements, crucial importance of data security and information access rights, how to deal with sub-outsourcing or fourth parties, as it's sometimes called, how to get your business continuity, and crucially your exit plans coordinated with your suppliers, even when you begin the process of outsourcing, and then reviewing on a regular cadence thereafter. The next part looks at systemic risks, which are, of course, particularly of interest to the regulators themselves. And by way of conclusion around this introduction, explains that the PRA does have a legal duty to consult and is doing its work in alignment with regulatory principles and the Treasury goals, for example, to promote competition and innovation. They make the point, quite rightly, that using third parties, outsourced suppliers, particularly around cloud services, for example, does promote competition and innovation, but it needs to be done in a prudent manner. So that's the first third of the paper that sets the context. The second two-thirds is then the draft supervisory statement, highlighted in red on your screens. First, it sets out the prudent basis of expectations that are placed on particularly category 1 and category 2 firms, those that can have the greatest impact on the economy and consumer expectations on you around outsourcing and third-party risk. It highlights that it is part of a broader context that we were discussing just as we got the call started. Crucially, of course, this draft supervisory statement /20, because it is expected to be published this year, complements the supervisory statements that is expected to be issued probably at the same time on operational resilience more broadly. We're going to be looking at third party and outsourcing in particular. There's some definitions. The definitions are all very simple. Essentially, a third party has a contract to provide products or services to a regulated firm in these definitions. Proportionality, one that I know a couple of organisations, Lewis and I, were talking to last week. Category 3 area, they really do feel the need for proportionality, and that's really around the size of your organisation. But your CEOs are invited to regular updates, and your regulator will have told you which category you're in, of course, which will set your approach to governance. It's a crucial phrase in the PRA's document about how boards need information to allow them to do their job, to robustly have challenge as well as oversight. They need, I think the phrase is, an appropriate level of technical detail provided. And there's some important phrases in there about how the information needs to be timely, of course, for that challenge to be appropriate. There were then details specified by the PRA on the sort of policy you should have for outsourcing and the record keeping you're required to have for managing those third parties that you're outsourced to. Then it talks through a key aspect of the life cycle of outsourcing before you outsource. Starting by thinking about the materiality of the outsource that you're going to do is, as Angela was highlighting earlier, is this a business process that's important. So the outsource that's related to that is absolutely crucial. And you should be looking at a variety of potential suppliers at that point for your exit plans, but also to think through at what point there might be in breach of your appropriate controls, including, of course, on security of information. When choosing the level of due diligence that is appropriate, the PRA highlights that it's still working through and would like comments on what are the indicators that would automatically define a third-party supplier as material, for example, in terms as relates to your threshold conditions, and encourages you to consider a number of items, including, of course, crucially, the IT and cybersecurity controls that the organisation has in place. Trust, but also verify on that, and think through the breach impact. What's it going to mean for all of your stakeholders if a supplier is breached? Later on in the life cycle of outsourcing, the PRA gives advice on the kind of agreements that you should have, including that you should set minimum cybersecurity standards, and indeed then has a whole chapter on the data security approach that you should adopt. So chapter 7 is one that we often get questions about and are actively supporting how to implement protection of outsourced data at those third parties. Crucially, not just to pass the data over and forget about it, but ongoing monitoring of the effectiveness of your supplier security controls, which is something, Vicky, I suppose, we'll be looking at during the example of Travelex you're going to give shortly. The PRA highlights the Bank of England and your rights to online real-time auditing of information. It specifies the phrase, online real-time reporting tools are strongly encouraged when checking certifications and compliance with security frameworks. There's a particular focus on sub-outsourcing. In other words, when a company that you've outsourced to, Mike, outsources itself, if there was to be an operational resilience challenge to you, and you realised it was coming from a supplier, if you then realised that the root cause was their supplier, let alone a supplier of theirs, fifth party, sixth party is not unheard of, absolutely, how to plan to be able to engage effectively with those, perhaps on the NIST, identify, defend, protect, but also respond and recover. How would you engage with those nth degree suppliers? Collaboration actually is something, if we have time, we can talk about working with your peers to do that. To recover is so much more ambiguous, so much more difficult to deal with. But then as we come towards the end of the PRA paper, appropriately enough, focusing on exits from third-party relationships. In particular, although they're rare, stressed exits. What are your rights going to be to change out suppliers, to take on staff if your supplier goes bankrupt, for example, and how do you, in a more cooperative way, agree governance and testing of business continuity. That's pretty much it on the content. Contingency plans are specified in some detail, such as those step-in rights I was referring to a moment ago. And then there's specific detail on guidance on the outsourcing register. So, for example, how many characters you should use to define the purpose for which a particular outsource is being used, which is largely so that the PRA themselves trust and sort this information. So use of industry codes, that sort of thing, company numbers, so they can find if there is a bottleneck on suppliers and so forth. I guess the of comments before handing over to Vicky to talk about Travelex as an example. Comments that others have given on this already. It's important to reflect that most Category 2 banks are going to have several hundred suppliers, some of them into the low thousands, and of course Category 1 can have several thousand suppliers. But materiality is a phrase that's used in the PRA paper. Some of us might use critical, important. How many material third parties do you have? We find that for most of the Category 1 and Category 2 banks that we're supplying, is between 20 and 50 that they're really focused on, wanting 24/7 alerts for example. And then there's a long tail of less important suppliers that you might want every 6 months or a year to take a view on. Which elements, which of those aspects of the paper are people most focused on? Business continuity and exit plans, which, as Mike knows, is something we particularly pride ourselves on helping organisations with. But the governance and record keeping, including around data security, is something that we're going to get to. Around that data gathering, at the moment it takes organisations quite a long time. They think, we know in some cases it's a little bit optimistic, but even the optimistic answers on some of these, we know that most banks are saying it will take about a week to pull together the sort of information about what their suppliers are doing for them. We think cyber is working at a much faster pace than that, which is why it'd be useful to take an example of how third parties can challenge operational resilience and risk tolerance, even if only gently, through those few consumers who were using Travelex. Vicky, would you like to take us through this?
Sure. If I can just, I'll let you know when I'm ready to go to the next slide. So I think it's really important to understand from a cyber perspective. The thing that you've got to be worried about is what the hackers can see. Because they don't look at your systems the same way you do. And you want to make sure that, and I had a police officer tell me this years ago, that you're less desirable than your neighbors. So looking at Travelex and many of its competitors over the last 12 months, we're looking at now a picture of the level of cybersecurity that the hackers would see. And if you had a view like this of your critical supplier against their peers, would it bother you if your supplier was that bright blue line on the bottom? Years ago now, and I'm not going to admit how many, the government published their 10 steps to cybersecurity. And in that, they made a really simple statement. Basic cyber hygiene prevents most breaches. I think I got even bullish about that and said 80%. Well, if we drill down into that hacker's eye view of cyber posture, we can see on the right that the Travelex posture had a number of holes in it. There were a number of places where their cyber hygiene was less than ideal. And poor cyber hygiene leads to breaches. Just something to think about. What do the hackers know about your suppliers that you don't? And how are they going to exploit that? Because as we've seen, the impact of breaches is really wide-ranging. So if we just look at Travelex, for instance, certainly there was the impact on Travelex. Their credit rating, or their credit was downgraded, their share price fell. I mean, I'm sure that they have had to pay quite a bit of overtime, so there'll have been a financial impact. So there was a direct impact on them. Beyond that, it really impacted their customers. So banks around the globe, I mean, this wasn't just their near neighbors, that this was around the globe, weren't able to fulfill currency orders. This is a huge impact. And then I think the other impact that has yet to truly been realized is the notice that the regulators will take of this. And, this isn't the kind of regulatory attention anybody wants. So how can we measure, monitor, and manage third-party cyber risk? We had a meeting back in December to discuss this. Starting from the then quite new paper from the regulator on third-party risk, there were a couple of points that came out of that. One is that there's already a requirement to build an outsourcing register. I would say, remember how long it took you to build your register for GDPR, and start cracking away at this one now, because this is not a small task. But then, and I think a very bullish statement for the regulator, they are recommending the use of real-time reporting tools rather than paper-based. I think this is a huge step forward. So again, for a moment, think about it. When you think about your suppliers, how do you verify their cybersecurity posture? Do you use the trust model? I.e., do you send them the self-certification questionnaire at some sort of regular frequency? And when the answers come back that they are doing absolutely wonderfully, do you put a tick in the box and move on? Or do you have some method of actually monitoring what their cyber posture looks like and comparing it to the self-certification questionnaire that they might have answered? I think the regulator is expecting us to go to that model where we put the two together. When our CROs and CISOs met in early December,
next one.
They came up with a number of recommendations about how we should be monitoring third-party risk management. They felt that the 24/7 automated monitoring was absolutely critical, but that you can't just monitor, you've got to take that data and do something with it. There needs to be a monthly review by the functional experts, the ones on the front line that are fighting the attackers, and make sure that they understand what the position is. There then needs to be some sort of brief exception report that goes up to the risk owners, because they need to understand where they're exposed. They were all quite excited to be able to use that automated monitoring to facilitate a really constructive two-way conversation with their suppliers so that they could work together to improve cybersecurity.
Thanks, Vicky. So yeah, Travelex. I think for many banks, there weren't many consumers that were directly impacted by that. You know, the percentage of their customers that might be traveling at that particular time and that had used the online platform to get cash from their third-party Travelex was relatively small. But it absolutely brings out some very good points you just highlighted. Thank you. And for me, that graph showed the Travelex score certainly wasn't the worst cyber posture we've ever seen, by no means, but it was 12 months lower than its peer group. It should cause people just to reflect.
If I can add to that, Kevin, not only was it consistently lower, it was consistently almost the same month to month, which really says to that hacker who's looking in that these people aren't regularly managing their cyber posture. Yes. And it makes them a more desirable target.
Sure, yes, absolutely.
Putting that from the user's perspective of that kind of tool, we take great pride in maintaining as high a possible score on that tool as we feasibly can. And if within any month there is some kind of downward shift because of change in the threat landscape or a change that's naturally or organically come through on Secure Trust Bank or any of our brands, we leap at those shifts in score and actively do what we can to maintain, not for the simple fact of score chasing, but because we recognise that if you don't deal with the hygiene factor today, the consequences of that hygiene factor being sub-optimal are just going to accelerate over the next days, weeks, months. So it's a great indicator as to whether or not you're on top of your game, or at least doing some kind of proactive risk management rather than reactive compliance reviews on an annual or 2 or 3 year basis.
Yeah, it's all about that cadence, that frequency, the speed. Cyber is different from other threats in many ways. The ambiguity is a key aspect, but the speed at which, as you say, Mike, your organic attack surface can change, the way the threats can evolve. Yes, you do need to run even to stay still. So let's look at the online demo. We're going to highlight areas like how you can compare and contrast suppliers early on, as the PRA was highlighting in the pre-outsourcing stage, and also how you can drill in deeper if you want to, using automated workflows, online tools to collect self-attestations. That's important, but then compare that with actual evidence. And we may look at the Sequest questionnaire, for example, on that. So for those of you who We've got a good number of our members online at the moment. While Lewis brings up the live platform, and maybe if I ask Angela just to do something technical and move the camera around slightly so that we're sure that Lewis is in picture. Lewis is now, I think, sharing his screen and is going to talk us through just some of the high-level things you can do with a sample of. We've got about 1,000 suppliers in there. But, well, over to you, Lewis.
Sure. So yeah, this is one of the portfolios with over 1,000 companies. As you can see, it's got the security score on the left-hand side. So at the moment, it's showing all A's, 100%, 100 scoring. And what you can actually do is sort that, so you can see those that have got the reverse of that. So the lower scores, the F grades, etc. And then also see the change in 30 days. So you can see the ones that have moved the worst over the last 30 days and those that have improved the most. And then what you can also do on the right hand side here is look at the filters. So look at various issue types. So for example, those that have had malware in the last month or year, then you can look at that portfolio at those organisations. Another thing that you can do is look at the overview. So if you have one of these portfolios, you can have a look at the average rating. In this case, it's 88 at a B grade, and then as well as the rating distribution. So we have 55% at A, 28% at B, etc. And then look at things like the worst performing companies, the most critical issues, and then the most common issues as well. And then here's just a visualization of that improving and declining score in the portfolio. So while this shows kind of a high-level view of the organisation, what you can actually do is go a bit further into that. So if we just take a deco, for example, the score is actually broken down into 10 different areas. So you've got things like network security, domain name server health, patching cadence, where hackers are talking about the organisation on the dark net. And then each section has various different issues that it will look for and look at an external view of that organisation to see if these issues are showing up. So things like sender policy framework, record missing, end of life products being shown, etc. And then if we click through on any of these issues, what it will do is load that particular issue, give you a description of what it is, the risk of having that particular issue, and a recommendation with some external references as well. This also shows a comparison of similar companies. So in this case, sender policy framework, record missing, 100% of organizations like Deco have this issue. And then it will list some more in-depth information here. So the domain and when it was last observed, depending on the issue, will give various different information for that. One of the other things you can do is you look at the list of all the issues, but propose a score plan. So you can generate one automatically, and it will tell you the things that you should look at improving on. And if you don't agree, you can adjust that, and then you may think that's more important or that's not as important, and then you can download that and actually have an action plan to execute and improve the cyber posture. We take a look at compliance as well. So it lists various different frameworks, so ISO, NIST, GDPR, the health insurance, HIPAA framework as well. And what this does is it lists the security policy on the left-hand side, so all the different areas of that framework, and then on the right-hand side, various findings that the platform's actually finding to question whether the organisation is compliant within that chapter. So you'll see the SPF record missing there and various different.
And I've found it really quite surprising how many organisations will have a properly acquired accreditation to a standard, and yet there are still findings that creep very quickly after the point of accreditation that demonstrate they're not necessarily operating their cyber hygiene as they should, or certainly as the certification suggests. So whilst it's incredibly convenient for all of us just to rely on our supply chain having the right badges, that gives a much more practical, real-time view as to whether there's actually active evidence of them looking after their controls and actually maintaining their visible attack surface properly.
Absolutely. So let's build on that and think about if you wanted a supplier mic to attest that it had certain certifications. Let's pull up Atlas, Lewis. We're getting into the last few minutes of the calls, and imagine that Mike wanted to send a questionnaire. You might have a preferred control framework or security standard that you wanted to ask some questions about. Which standards do you like?
From a information governance perspective, we always start with ISO because that tells you at least something about the governance of the organisation.
There is a library of alternatives. I personally prefer NIST, Mike, but
technical controls, I agree. Yeah.
or if you close that, Lewis, there's the Bank of England Sequest, which is based on my preferred NIST standard. But yeah, there are different ways of doing it. Crucially, when you're working with your colleagues in procurement, for example, they may be concerned about ethics, environment, anti-money laundering, anti-modern slavery. You can, as Lewis is highlighting, upload your own questions to add into that library of security questions. But crucially, as Lewis is showing, then send that just once a year you can load a CSV file of perhaps 600, 1,000 suppliers, a bit like perhaps you did with GDPR. You can then set that to be an automatic reminder, please, just once a year as a supplier. But yeah, you mentioned every week, Mike. Well, you could be kind and send a reminder to your suppliers maybe a week in advance, as Lewis is doing. Oh, Lewis is even suggesting that you should speak to them first before you throw that across the fence. And if we maybe, Lewis, pull up an example of a questionnaire that is live. You've got the Sequest questionnaire sent to Cyber Rescue. Great, just scroll down a little bit. Let's look at some of the. Oh yeah, that's a good. Or maybe the next question. Yeah, you've got what's that question, Lewis?
So, are end-of-life hardware and software assets identified and effectively managed prior to expiration?
Okay, yep. And as a bank, Mike, you would have been able to choose A, B, C, D when self-grading. What would you give yourself?
Obviously an A.
Obviously, yeah. But if I was the regulator or if I was your customer, I might want to know whether it was worth following up with you on that. And one of the nice things on the platform is on the right-hand side, it shows the external, objective, timely information. It's not completely comprehensive, but just gives you an indication. Is this an area that's worth following up with? Of course, it's Cyber Rescue Alliance that's data is being shown here. If you go back up, you had, what was the one before this?
Are hardware and software vulnerabilities proactively identified and documented with their risk assessment?
And again, like many of these controls, it's a bureaucracy question. It's a process question, is the more flattering term. It's about, have you got a piece of paper in the drawer that if the Bank of England was to come along and say, oh yes, you signed that off, have you?
Most of the answers are between the 4 steps seem to be kind of divided into 2. The right-hand side of the scale is, are you actually lacking? The left-hand side, so the A and the B answers are typically, how mature are you for this? So can you truly evidence it? And is it just on your critical systems or all systems? I think it's often an indicator in these kind of questions. But again, if somebody's answered that and said that all systems are patched and all end of life and app support assets are absolutely dealt with in an appropriate fashion, but there's some detected unpatched or a delay in the patching cadence of an organisation, that just gives you the evidence that the answer that's been provided by a supplier is not necessarily indicative or representative of what their actual estate is demonstrated.
Yeah, fantastic. And so if you wanted to engage further, Lewis, perhaps you can show us some of the things about chatting just on a particular question, or for the supplier to add evidence, maybe a certificate, as Vicky was highlighting, a network diagram, probably not, a photo of your CISO, whatever evidence you think is going to be compelling to your customers. And of course, with your suppliers, you can ask them to do the same. And if we go back, Lewis, to the main scorecard platform, there are a variety of ways that you can invite a company, like a Deco, I see you've got up there. If they were the supplier of your mobility solution, you could say that as part of our expectations, we want you to be a certain grade on your cyber hygiene that, as Vicky was saying, externally can see. Having an objective external lens, you could do that. You could generate reports, a summary report or a detailed one to send across, or to have in your hand when you're having a quarterly or annual supplier review. But yeah, once we've got that up, Lewis, if we just then jump back to the slides, because we've promised to finish before the hour, let's just come then towards a conclusion. Those of you who don't already have access to the dashboard, do reach out to Lewis. His slides are at the end of his email address is at the end of these slides. And there's a variety of other things we haven't shown you about how we can help you to present information on your portfolio of suppliers. But I think for now we have covered what we wanted to. So we really hope that you will work with us, the Cyber Rescue Alliance, to measure, monitor, and crucially mitigate your cyber risks in 2020. Thank you very much, everyone. We'll drop out now. Thank you very much. We'll wrap up here and have a cup of coffee, cup of tea that we discussed. Thank you, everybody. We'll follow up with you online, those of you who dialed in. And we'll be putting our slides up onto our LinkedIn page so you can share with your colleagues quite easily. Thank you very much.